right, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the webinar, the HR Webinar Series 2011 for the Organizational Development Toolkit. We're delighted to have you join us for the second part of our series. And why don't we wait about one more minute before we actually get started and launch into the presentation in case there's some additional people that are just signing on. All right, so welcome again. We're going to go to the next slide. And just to do a quick review, we have some new people that are joining us for the seminar today. So we wanted to spend some time giving an up-close view on how we actually do our organizational development assessments in the BizPsych division. And we're fortunate today. I'm here with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Robert Mines, who is our CEO and a psychologist, and who puts his signature on a lot of the organizational development interventions that we've done over the years. So we're really delighted to have him. Patrick is on vacation, for those of you that are wondering where Patrick is, and he'll be back for the next one. So when we talked last time, we went over just in general what we would plan to cover during this series, including the different case studies that we would use as a benchmark for each webinar series. And this program is going to cover really what an organizational development assessment involves. We're going to spend some time talking about the actual assessment process today. And then on Wednesday, August 17th, we will talk about, I think the date's here wrong. I'm sorry. The next session is going to be on the fine art of report writing. And then the session after that will be on the action plan. So today we're just going to cover the actual assessment process. All right. In session number one, what we looked at are what are the types of situations that would actually lead to an organizational development assessment. And we asked questions such as, well, what keeps people up at night? How do they know what the pain points are? And we engaged you to think about some of the complex issues that you face and continue to face in your organization, especially when it comes to enhancing work performance, enhanced teams, increased productivity, improving the morale in the department or within the organization, culture change projects. Those are some of the themes that we talked about. Then we asked you to look at what organizational development resources do you have. Oftentimes we partner with our clients that have internal organizational development consultants, HR practitioners, and we did talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages to working internally versus bringing in an outside consultant. And then the last part that we talked about is what strategy do you need when you're looking at the possible options that you have. And some of those considerations included who were the key decision makers, what was the budget that was allowed for this, what have you done in the past, and where have you found money to help resolve these kinds of complex issues before. So the three case studies that we talked about were different in nature, which is why we picked them, and there were some common denominators and yet some individual nuances for each one. So the first case study that we presented was about a specific facility where they were having a lot of issues around leadership turnover. And we were asked to help identify what some of the root causes were that were leading to the high degree of turnover. There were issues around lack of trust, compromised morale, and they wanted to try and create a culture change and find a way to enhance communication within this facility. The next one that we talked about had to deal with a service department that had three different levels of employees that were working in that department, and there was a lot of consternation, unresolved personal conflicts, there were workflow inefficiencies, and what they were finding is that they had a real diffusion of responsibility and a lack of personal accountability. So they asked us to come in and help them identify what the root causes were and then provide some recommendations. And the last one had to deal with a professional practice group that started out initially to help the owners determine if the group, if all the members that were part of that ownership group were a good fit. There was one member in particular that they had concerns about, and as a result of starting there, a significant amount of dysfunction started to evolve and become apparent to us. So even though this started as a presenting problem of one particular issue to help them resolve, in terms of culture person fit or environment fit, it turned out to be much broader in scope and far more complex than the initial presenting problem, which isn't that unusual. It's not uncommon for organizations to identify a symptom and yet not really understanding what the root causes are, and it can be far more complex than they originally thought. Anything you want to add to that, Bob?
Well, and some of the complexities of that particular practice group involved individual psychopathology in various forms all the way through systems design problems and lack of sophistication on the part of the ownership group about how to run their board of directors and hold the CEO accountable. So it was a very interesting engagement that had multiple levels from a psychological standpoint that we were able to be useful on.
And we'll talk more about that as we go through the seminar today. But that's a great, this gives you an overview, especially for those that are joining us for the first time, about understanding the 3 case studies that we'll be using throughout the series. So today our focus is on the art of an effective organizational assessment. And we wanted to start out with a poll, so I'll go to the next slide, to find out how many of you have conducted an assessment. Now, this could be a partial assessment. It could be something that started out as a HR investigation around sexual harassment, hostile work environment, leadership complaints about leadership, complaints on a compliance hotline, any type of investigation that you've done, or any type of organizational development assessment. So I'm going to launch the polling question, and we're going to wait just a minute to see what kind of a response we get. Okay, so some of the votes are coming in. We have about 70% of you have voted, so we'll wait just a little bit longer, see if we can get some more votes in. Okay, we're up to 85% of you have voted. Okay, well it looks like more than half of you, 55% of you, have done some type of an assessment, and 36% of you have not. So that's great, because that suggests to us that you have some familiarity with the process, you've had some experience doing your own assessments, or working with a consultant that's helped you do them.
So at this point, most organizations know they have pain of some kind. The key question is what now? And so you may actually, with your own assessments, have a working hypothesis as to what the pain's about. However, often we get brought in order to refine the diagnosis. And so part of the questions have to do with if you have your idea, why wouldn't you just deliver a canned strategic intervention? And that particular question is an interesting one, because it really depends on how accurate your primary diagnosis on the issue was. And so in the example of the professional practice group, you know, the presenting problem had to do with goodness of fit on the board. What really became the problem was leadership psychopathology and dysfunction, organizational design issues. It was a company that should have been functioning with a true executive group, and it was really functioning as a mom and pop. One of the quotes was, you know, I run this organization from a cigar box, and this was a very large revenue-producing professional practice, and clearly did not fit that criteria. So to have, and then as we mentioned earlier, there were issues around board governance, accountability with the CEO, and on down the line. So in that particular case, a canned strategic intervention of oh, let's just do an assessment on the one individual, see if they're a good fit or not, and move on as a board, would have missed 99% of the dysfunction that was going on behind the initial request. So to have jumped into a canned strategic intervention would not have been appropriate in that particular case. It was a custom intervention across many areas. We can talk about it at another time. Why wouldn't you design an intervention based on internal experts' information? It's the classic problem of treating yourself, if you're the doctor, in this case, if you're the HR professional or the owner or someone up higher in the managerial hierarchy. And so there's a response bias that you actually have all the information. It sounds like we have a friend of ours who left his phone in the room, so that's what that's about. Sorry about that. And so that response bias, for example, to go back to the professional practice group, they actually had done their own internal assessment, and they had their own information, and it was incomplete, significantly incomplete in that case. And the third piece of this is, why not just meet with those who's affected by the problem and get it all on the table and straighten it all out. Well, in this case, again, there was, as an example, there was insufficient information that the leadership had. And so to identify just those affected by the problem, missed all the others who were silent but were also affected by the problem in that particular case. And that was true in actually the other two examples that Marcia gave as well. So that's where it can be very helpful to have a more comprehensive assessment of the organization from on whoever is doing that assessment, assuming that the trust is there and that those doing the assessment have enough objectivity and professional freedom to drill down on the information as it comes in. And so if you're an internal OD practitioner, that can be difficult sometimes to be a hero in your own backyard, even though we know of multiple internal OD departments that do a fantastic job. Yet there are times where they run into roadblocks and bring us in just because they just doesn't matter what they do to ensure trust on the part of the department. Sometimes the issues are big enough that they really have to bring in outside experts on this.
You know, I'd just like to add two thoughts to that. On the bullet point about why not use an internal expert, to Bob's point about the filter, sometimes it's difficult for the participants to feel comfortable trusting that the internal OD consultant will listen and they'll remain confidential, that there won't be retribution or retaliation. And so the information that they get, people might not be as willing with full disclosure. So we have oftentimes found that there's a collective sigh of relief when an outside person is coming in and they're perceived as the neutral party. And then on the last one, oftentimes what's happened when we've had those, get it all out on the table, if those meetings aren't facilitated well, it can actually create more damage. We've been called in sometimes to clean up the mess after a well-intended facilitator internally has tried to get the root issues out on the table or tried to mediate the conflicts without understanding the root causes. So that's another reason why that let's just get it out on the table without a plan in place, and clear objectives and outcomes can be more problematic sometimes.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide.
Okay.
So one of the key questions to ask your executive teams and your clients, as it were, it's important to know what the desired outcomes are, because it's really going to vary. And so some of them may be financial outcomes, some of them may be group cohesiveness outcomes. So the first one obviously can be a measurable issue. Group cohesiveness is one of those subjective work group functioning outcomes that certainly people can give their perceptions of whether they're working more cohesively or not in a more integrated way. And And there are ways to benchmark that on a subjective basis, but those become a little softer types of outcomes. So the more detailed you can get in terms of the desired outcome up front, the easier it is to continue to do the intervention, the assessment and the interventions, and recalibrate as you go, because you're definitely going to have that opportunity, and that's going to be crucial. Oftentimes these changes can take a half a year to 2 or 3 years to implement, as all of you know, and so knowing that up front can help you determine whether or not you really, as an organization, have the will and the fortitude to proceed, because that's what it takes when it gets messy in the mid range of making these changes and the scope of the outcome in the project. So, you know, I alluded to what is the scope. Often the scope can have feature creep, if you will, in the sense that the deeper you get sometimes, the more things need to be adjusted within the system. And so that's important from a budgetary standpoint as well as a psychological commitment standpoint. Now there's a question of who will receive the report of your assessment, and that's an interesting piece too, because obviously there is usually the executive group in many cases, if the organization is small to mid-range, will receive that report because they're actually the ones approving the budget and funding it. In larger organizations, it might be a VP, director, or it could even be a manager of a large enough group, and the information doesn't necessarily go on up above that. So if you're the one who's doing the assessment or an outside consultant on it, you want to know who the audience is and who actually is the client here, because that's going to be a crucial piece. You know, we've had situations where organizations had a norm that everybody on the team should receive the report. And sometimes that's okay, and we've also run into times where there was actually HR and EEOC confidential information that came up that not all the employees should receive those reports, just because of the turn out to be a confidentiality violation because of as we had alluded to before, individual psychopathology that now becomes protected information under your medical side. So that becomes an element as well in terms of the type of report, who gets it, and then of course there's always the legal considerations in any of these assessments if you have some type of impaired leadership, because you don't know where folks are going to be lined up on the potential lawsuits once all that information comes out. So the fourth piece of this is what will be the decision-making process. So you have it, you get your diagnosis. How are you going to decide? Who are the decision makers on whether to proceed or not? Who actually has the final yes or no on it? How does the budget come back into that decision process? And is that an upfront issue that you have it versus one engagement that we had is the decision makers said, how much is this going to cost? And we gave them an estimate that it was going to be somewhere in over $100,000 initially, but who knew, because we hadn't really had a chance to do the full assessment to give them a full recommendation. And that decision maker, the budget process was whatever it costs, it'll be worth it. So of course, from our point of view, those were made us smile. The actual reality for most of our clients, however, is that you know, there are budget processes that have to be adhered to on these types of things, on the one hand. On the other hand, rarely do organizations budget for these things. So then the question for you and your decision-making staff has to do with, well, how have we found the money in the past, assuming that you've gone through some type of process like that. And if you haven't, then it's still a good question. Well, how have you found the money for non-budgeted items before? And where does that come from? And then there's always the important question in this decision process of, well, what happens if we don't do something about it? What's that going to cost us? So those all become part of that whole decision-making process after you've received the report and have recommendations on what the next steps are.
So what I'd like to do now is just go over our case studies and give you a feel for the specific designs that we had for these particular assessments. So the first one was on the facility where there was leadership turnover. And the scope of this was we conducted 45-minute interviews with 27 different individuals that worked in different departments throughout that facility. And it included those in a leadership role, those that were professional salaried individuals, as well as hourly frontline staff. And this scope was to help determine what the factors were that were driving so much turnover and to understand why the morale had been so compromised. They had received a number of complaints on their compliance hotline. They had concerns about the quality of services that were being delivered to their residents or customers in this case. And they really wanted to find a way to have more effective communication to make sure that messages that were sent from the leadership were not misinterpreted or misconstrued, which it seemed like there was a real pervasive rumor mill that was going on within that organization. And this report, as Bob was talking about who gets to receive the report, they were very clear that they only wanted the report to go to the key members of the executive leadership team. And what we did in this case is we provided talking points for the leaders then to share that information with the staff. The next one that we did was the intervention on the department that had 3 different groups that were working there, and this was around the dysfunction on a team. And this assessment was requested again by the executive leadership team, both within the department itself as well as the corporate headquarters. And they were looking for ways to help improve the culture there. So we conducted 22 interviews. They were an hour-long interviews. They were open-ended, semi-structured by design, with 22 department staff members, which really covered the entire department. And in addition to that, we collected some information and data from follow-up meetings, conversations with the administrator, the former manager of the department, the interim manager, as well as the internal OD consultant that they had. And we really were trying to understand each constituent's perspective on what the contributing factors were that were creating bottlenecks and constraints in the workflow, a lot of consternation and unresolved conflicts, a lot of tension in their department meetings, and we were really trying to understand what types of factors were going on for people that they were pretty stuck in their positions. And in that case, too, we did not provide a written report, but we did do a highlighted summary with the entire department when the assessment was completed. And then the last case study was the professional private practice. And this is really interesting because initially the scope of the assessment was to determine whether or not that one owner was a good fit for the group. And it became much bigger as things unraveled. And so the scope included an intervention plan for an impaired CEO. It included an organizational redesign plan, executive coaching for key members on the practice of between the owners, the board of directors, and managers. It included revision of their human resources policies, the board of directors bylaws, and reconciliation of financials. So that was really extensive in its scope, even though it didn't turn out that way. And we initially started with 6 interviews of all the owners for about an hour-and-a-half to 2-hour interviews. So that just gives you an idea of the types of project designs that we've worked with.
Well, and on that particular one, that was a multi-month assessment and intervention all at the same time. So after the very first assessment, which was to assess the one owner and their goodness of fit, it was very clear that the other owners were completely off base. That this particular owner actually was viewed as problematic because they were actually making, this person was making systemic intervention recommendations for the evolution of the organization and was viewed as a troublemaker. And when we actually had a chance to sit down with that person, that person's perspective actually was an invaluable resource to that organization. And then, as Marcia said, we ended up interviewing all the owners. And then after about 8 or 9 months, when the level of dysfunction became so clear, in addition to what she's already said, there was an assessment of everyone at the mid-level management level as well. And so there was a report that came out of that one that resulted in another round of interventions and some significant distress for the organization, to say the least, before they were able to get to a level where their accountabilities on the first assessments and recommendations were being executed on, and design issues were being invoked. HR policies were being changed. Literally, financial controls were being put in place that hadn't been there. Owners hadn't seen financials in a year and a half. There were a number of things about that assessment and report that were very, very intriguing.
I think they didn't really know how vulnerable they were in so many areas and the liabilities potential liabilities that they were facing until we were able to help them uncover those and then address them appropriately. So let's go to another polling question. Let's see if, oh, there we go. Okay. So this question is, I need some help here because I'm not seeing it on the screen. Oh, when you have done some form of an assessment, where did the request originate from? So you've got some multiple choices for you, whether they came from organizational leadership, manager complaints, employee complaints, customer complaints, or somewhere from outside the organization. Let's see. Looks like the poll's in progress. There we go. Okay, we're getting some people to submit their votes. Okay, about 62% have voted, so we'll wait just another half a minute or so. Okay, well, almost 80% of you have submitted a vote, and it looks like 60% of the requests come from employee complaints, and 40% come from organizational development leadership, somewhere, whether it's the executive leadership team or somebody, the CEO level of the organization. And I would say that's not uncommon. I would say most often when we talk to HR practitioners, they have received a number of complaints from employees that seem to have been brought up to their attention. And sometimes it could be that the organizational leadership is trying to be proactive about making certain changes. They know they need to make a cultural shift to be competitive, and they're looking for ways to do that. Anything you want to add to that?
No.
Okay. So thank you for voting. Okay. All right. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I'm going to close this poll. It's already closed. Okay. So one of the things to ask when we're doing an assessment and we're thinking about the project design is who to include in the assessment. And these are some suggestions that we talk to our clients about. Clearly, you want to include those that are voicing the complaint to understand, what their issues are, what the complaint is about, how they're experiencing it, and those that are impacted by the complaint. Sometimes it could be another department that might be impacted by the complaint. Sometimes it could be a it could be another subgroup within a department that is feeling the impact. So we want to identify who's being impacted as well as those that are voicing the complaint. I think what's really important when we do these assessments is to collect a diverse group of perspectives. So that could be the newer employees. Sometimes we'll have a client say, you know, well, this person has only been on board with the group for 2 weeks or for a month. Should we include them? And there is a real advantage to getting a beginner's eye because they see things differently. They're not as entrenched. They're not as locked in. They might have a different basis for comparing how things are done in their new organization compared to how they've done things in the past. They might not be as biased. So we do encourage, if there are newer employees, to make sure that their opinions and their observations are heard. It's important to get the more seasoned employees that have been around for a while. They have a different point of comparison. They have different experiences to share. And then we might have people say, well, we've got some people that have resigned or they're on their way out. Should we include those? And our answer is absolutely, because they might not have anything left to lose by being, you know, kindly honest and being very transparent in their communication with us. Or they might have some really helpful ideas and suggestions. There might be a reason why they're on their way out. That could be valuable to understand. Internal customers can offer an interesting perspective of what it's like to receive products or services from your group, and then members of the leadership team. So the takeaway from this is to be very complete and comprehensive when it comes to deciding who to include in the assessment. And we appreciate that sometimes getting everybody's opinion can be difficult. You have to balance that out with people that want to voice their opinion, and if not everybody's given an invitation to participate in the assessment, if people will feel left out. So this is a part to spend quite a bit of time and being very thoughtful and methodical about who to include in the assessment. Bob, do you want to add anything to that?
I have nothing further to add, as Charlie Munger would say.
Okay. So we're going to go on to the next slide, which is you.
Okay, so I'm putting on my professorial psychometric psychologist hat here. So when we or you or anyone does an assessment, there are obviously questions of reliability and validity that are fundamental and foundational to any individual or group psychological assessment. So it's a little tough because in some ways the reliability question is, how consistent would somebody answer this over time? And when you have variables that have that get better and worse, you obviously want them to be able to change if you interviewed people. So so that's one background issue, and then the validity of, you know, how truthful with a small t is this data? How accurate is this data? You know, does it really reflect the actual phenomena that's going on? And so those become important elements. When we do individual interviews, in order to increase the consistency across those, we typically have a structured or semi-structured interview that we do with some questions that might be germane to everybody, and then the freedom of the interviewer's part to be able to drill down with particular information as it evolves in the interview. So we get some consistency across interviews, and then there's also variability there around what we might actually get from a given individual. And some of that has to do with a variety of factors. It has to do with their level of complexity in the organization, their role in the hierarchy, their own individual filters and belief systems about how things ought to be or should be done in the organization. On group interviews, it's an interesting dynamic, and it really shifts things because you can get either a conservative shift out of the group, or you can get a risky shift out of the group depending on their own group dynamics and how that works with the interviewer. And so if you're doing group interviews where you bring a whole department together, you just have to be sensitive to the issue that there are people who may not speak up because it's in a group, and you may have folks who speak up who have a disproportionate voice then in terms of the data that's presented. So that one becomes a little trickier. What it does allow you to do is, if you actually are not looking at content but process, you do get a pretty good sense of levels of trust. You get a sense of the dominance hierarchy in the group, the formal versus informal leaders, and a variety of other things that have nothing to do with the content, but certainly a lot to do with the process of how that group functions. Anonymous surveys, whether online or written, is certainly fraught with variance as well. So on the one hand, it's important to know who for the assessor anyway, probably to know who the person was that gave a particular set of answers, because on the one hand you can argue that, well, if it's anonymous, people will be truthful. On the other hand, the downside of it is, if it's anonymous, people can take pot shots and there's no accountability around it. So that becomes a trade-off for you or for the assessor on that. And whether it's done online or in some kind of paper format, it's still the same problem. Now, with surveys, there's a whole nother set of psychometric considerations, and that actually has to do with item construction and the type of scaling that goes into that survey question versus an open-ended written response. And if you're not really clear about the anchors on some kind of Likert scale, you can have a great deal of difficulty interpreting the information even from a questionnaire. Oftentimes folks will combine two or more constructs into one question, which makes it uninterpretable because you don't know what they really were answering. Was it, Marcia is smart and athletic? I agree or strongly disagree. Well, if I agree, am I responding to the smart part or the athletic part or both parts? And we can't interpret it because we really don't know. So you really need to be very careful around the constructs you're using in the items, making sure they only deal with one construct at a time, and that everybody knows what that construct means. This is a wonderful place to work. What does that mean? What does a wonderful place to work mean without some kind of definition for them? So it gets a little more complicated at that point. Certainly concepts such as frequency, intensity, and duration become relevant in any interview or survey. How frequently does it happen? How intense does it happen? How long does it last? If you're getting at information about the system, the organization, beyond that, the culture, individual behavior. So if when in doubt, always revert back to frequency, intensity, and duration as a basis for the types of information you're trying to achieve. Let's go on to the next one, unless you have something to add.
Well, just on the last point about early distribution of the questionnaire, we have worked with groups where that they know that their employees in that department are introverted by design. Their nature is that they're introverted, and so because they're thoughtful and reflective and they're not as comfortable responding on the spot, we have given questionnaires maybe 1 or 2 days in advance. We don't encourage doing it more than that because we want to avoid group contagion or group sync, where people have a chance to huddle together and decide what their answers will be. However, sometimes that is, depending on the audience, another option.
Yeah, and I think Marcia has a wonderful point about this issue that has to do with complex problems and ill-structured situations, that because of the complexity, sometimes an off-the-cuff answer is not your best answer. It's just a reactive answer versus someone who's really had time to think through some of the issues that can show up in a written questionnaire. And where we've done that is we've given them the written questionnaire and then followed up with individual interview to drill down on even further with them. And so, for example, in every one of the 3 case studies, they were much more complex systemically than the initial assessment of what the pain was by the individuals that brought us in. So complexity of the problem lends itself to a more in-depth either written and or interview situation. So what kinds of questions asked? This is certainly just a sampler. And they're pretty straightforward. So what's currently working well? And this question to start out with creates a different mindset on the part of the interviewee than the second question, which is, what's the biggest challenge or problem? And you create a response bias depending on which one you ask first, and they're both important to ask. Bottlenecks or constraints in the workflow, constraint theory. Goldrat's work is it often comes up that wherever the weakest link is in the process, that's where your constraint's going to be, and it's very interesting to start looking at those things. So in our healthcare clients, patient flow from when they check in to when they get through a particular clinic becomes an interesting question around constraints. If it's a leadership or management issue, observations of a supervisor or manager, so that's pretty wide open, and then allows itself for drill down unless you have some specific things about that supervisor or manager that you want to know. It's always interesting to ask the individual employee who had the complaint about, well, are there any behaviors you have that are contributing to the situation? Because we all exist in the system and we're all interacting with each other, and we do have an impact, even if we are the victim, if you will, in a true sense of that word. What do you need from leadership? Sometimes that can be very helpful just from the standpoint of leadership may think the rank and file need one thing, and they may have a whole different set of agendas that might not be as sophisticated or as demanding as what leadership thinks might need to be done. This is a simple subjective rating on a scale of 1 to 9. How would you rate the trust level? Again, there's things that that clearly are subjective. However, they can be documented and then actually quantified, and you can use those as base rate data to look at change. How would you describe the culture of a department or organization? For my definition, culture is the shared set of beliefs on how we do business. They're the operating rules of a given organization versus the emotional climate of an organization. So that's one of those constructs that really needs to be thought through if you're going to ask those types of questions. Suggestions for making improvements. It's an interesting piece on if I have suggestions and I'm, let's assume there's level 1 employees, level 2, level 3, and level 1 employees are the ones who do the work. Level 2 employees are supervisors who oversee quality and assign the work, and level 3 people are managers who make sure the systems are in place so the 2s and the 1s can do the work. It's important to have a context of, what authority and accountability do each of these employees have when they make suggestions for how to make improvements. So, if it's a departmental morale issue and I have some employees say, I'd really like you to change the brand of coffee in the coffee room, that would help my morale. That's a whole different level of suggestion than a level 3 manager who might come in and say, we have an antiquated database, we can't get information out in order to make timely decisions, and their recommendations are going to involve hundreds, if not thousands, if not more, of resources and dollar allocation to fix that problem than the simplistic one that I overstated about, I really do like Folgers, quit buying Starbucks. So those are just a sampler of how these questionnaires get developed. And certainly once you have an idea of your situation, they can be more targeted.
So at this point, we have decided we're doing an assessment. We have decided who will be participating in the interview process. We've come up with the methodology for how we're going to gather the information. And then there's the opportunity to tell your staff, tell the members that we're bringing in an outside consultant, or we're using our internal consultant to do an assessment. And it's really important how you tee this up to people, because if it's not done well, it creates a lot of angst, a lot of fear, and a lot of anxiety for people because they're not sure what the intent is. So a couple of different ways to be able to tell the staff that you're planning to do an assessment. One is simply to conduct an all-staff meeting. The advantage to this is that everybody hears the same messaging at the same time. It's an opportunity to clarify, to answer questions, to help people understand what the intent of the assessment is. Another option is to bring in the consultants if you're using outside facilitators, or even if you're using your internal OD consultants if the staff isn't familiar with them, and introduce them so people feel more comfortable. There's a face to the name. They have a feel for them. They can answer questions about the process if people might have them. And so that's another option for you. And then what we've done for a number of our clients is we've provided a letter of introduction that helps explain what the assessment process entails, how the information is collected, how it's used, what the intended outcomes are. And sometimes people feel a lot more comfortable if they have a sheet in front of them that highlights what the next steps will be. So when you're in that process of putting together your introduction, here are some really important points to make, whether you do it through a meeting or through a written piece of communication, is that you want to highlight the level of commitment to the process. You need to let people know that you are committed to gathering the information and equally committed to implementing the recommendations to move a department forward. This lets people know that you're serious, that the employees are valued, that they are viewed as an important resource worth spending time and money on. We encourage you to frame it up as a positive opportunity. Sometimes people, for whatever reason, think it's meant to be punitive, and if you really, invite them to look at it as an opportunity to share their ideas and suggestions, that can go a long way. To look at it as a needs assessment, to be able to identify what's working well and where are areas for improvement, that goes a long way for people understanding that it is an opportunity. And that the focus is on business systems. It's really on looking at ways to improve efficiencies, to create a more effective work environment for people to be productive, for people to feel comfortable at work. And this makes it feel less personal in a sense that it puts people on the defense or having people feel guarded. You want to let them know that the consultant will be providing recommendations for actionable items and that they'll have a menu of things to consider and to choose from. It's important to let people know that individual names are not used in the report. This gets asked a lot of times, even after we've had the introductory meeting. People want to be assured that they can share information openly and not worry about retaliation or retribution. And another key piece of information to share with your staff is that there will be some type of a follow-up meeting to share the highlights of the report. It's wonderful to extend an invitation for people to be heard, and the follow-up meeting is a validation that their opinions have been listened to. It's also an opportunity to take a pulse read. What I mean by that is sometimes if we are conducting the assessment the first week in June, by the time we put together the information, analyze the data, write the report, put together the recommendations, have a follow-up meeting with the leadership team to go over the report, it might be 4 or 5 weeks later before we actually get in front of the all-staff meeting to go over the highlights. And a lot of things can shift in that time period. So when we meet with the department to go over the highlights, we also want to take a pulse read to see if what we have concluded, what we've analyzed, what we have identified as the root causes, if that resonates with people, if it still feels like it's on target. So that's another reason why it's important to do that pulse read.
Okay, so with the assessment process, there are a number of things that you're going to need to be able to address and resolve. So certainly within some employee groups, there's a mistrust of the whole process. Either it's been misused in the past or the trust level is compromised enough that that they really don't believe that leadership and management is actually going to follow through with the process and honor their element. You run into a different type of employee situation where it's just apathy and indifference. And remember, indifference is the near enemy of equanimity. They don't have it. They just don't care. Time. Sometimes organizations are spread too thin so that they don't have actually time to take people offline to do the assessment. We've already talked about money earlier. The individual focus can vary widely if it's not structured through the assessment process. Groupthink, again, where the group gets together outside to position their overall responses, so it's not the best indicator of what's really going on. And then we talked about anonymity versus confidentiality. Positive assessment outcomes. One of the things that you get is that everyone has a voice, and that's important on an individual psychological level. They feel heard. Certainly getting the viewpoints, if they are well-founded and variable, clarifying that's essential. Trust can be established at a higher level. Expectations are clarified. You can start looking at what the conclusions might be. Certainly there's an action plan, and having hope is essential in any organization going forward. So let's move on because we have about 8 minutes. We're going to make sure that we have time for some questions.
All right. So what happens after you do the assessment? Well, you want to manage the expectations about the time frame. How long will it take? When do you anticipate that the all-staff meetings will be in terms of sharing the highlights of the report, when the interviews will be conducted? You want to talk about the ongoing communication. And sometimes when we actually do the assessment and start asking the questions and conducting the interviews, it becomes an intervention in and of itself, in that once people are heard, they're freed up more psychologically, emotionally, they can be more productive. There might be ongoing communication about the process. You want to be sure that there's an opportunity to ask additional questions about if there's any new presenting concerns that have arisen, if there's new observations, if there's anything else that needs to be uncovered. So, and we might, as consultants, be asking additional questions. As we go further into the process, it's not uncommon that there are more things that we want to find out about. New events and changes, that can be that staff members have changed, people have come, people have left, there are changes in the system or the protocol. That might have an impact on the assessment. And then re-clarifying the process. What we mean by that is maybe there's additional people that need to be involved in it. Maybe the reporting process needs to shift. Sometimes we might find out that there's another constituent group that wants to have a report, or they want more detail, or they actually want less detail than we originally talked about. So it really is an ongoing process. I think we have one more polling question. So let me open that up here. All right. Okay. And all right. When Bob was talking about the challenges, we wanted to find out which one of these has been the greatest challenges for you when you've been doing your assessment. Is it time, money? Oh, time, money, apathy or indifference? We've done this before. Nothing's ever going to change. Groupthink could be we have some really strong and formal leaders that are going to influence people, or is there anything else that has contributed to this being a challenge?
We don't know if you can hear it, but we have a big rainstorm going on here that's creating some background noise for us. So if you can, we apologize. And if you can't, you can put it as a context for why do Bob and Marcia sound so funny at the moment.
This is really interesting. So far, 82% of you have responded, and for almost half of you, it's a time constraint, and that's not surprising. And about a third of you are saying apathy and indifference. And I don't know, that could mean that it's hard to get buy-in from the leadership group, or you think that people are already down that path where they might not be as willing to be engaged. And nobody put money as a constraint. We like to hear that, don't we?
That's a beautiful thing.
All right. So we're coming to the end. And Bob and I want to thank you for making time to join us today. If you have any questions, you can certainly type them in. We've got a few minutes left that we can answer them. And if you'd like a copy of the presentation or any additional information, feel free to email myself or Patrick. Even though he's not here, he has all the materials as well. And then last, I just wanted to remind you about the upcoming webinar that we'll be having in August. And that will be on August 17th, Wednesday, the same time again, 11 to 12. And that will focus on the fine art of report writing. You know, how do you assess, how do you gather the information, what format do you put it in, how extensive do you want the report to be, do you use graphs, you know, what types of areas, thinking of contents go into the report, from the analysis to the presenting problem and recommendations. So we'll go over what an extensive report would look like. Anything you want to add in closing?
No, I think we covered it. Now it looks like so far there aren't any questions, so we'll give it about another 30 seconds, and if not, you can certainly ask us individually as well. Their email addresses are on there. If you want to contact me directly, it's ramine@bizpsych.com. And with that, it looks like everyone's satisfied up to this point, so we will bid you adieu, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you. We look forward to joining with you in August. Bye.